And I think one of the things I've been trying to begin to tease out from different people across these interviews is just how difficult that makes it. So if we come back to the, and maybe I should ask you afterwards if there is a difference between treatment and recovery. But if we come back to what people perceive as treatments, it seems possible that people can prescribe those. They seem pretty comfortable manualizing them. They seem to be pretty capable of almost being able to regulate them, and by definition, purchase something that might be really similar in one place to another. That a methadone program here might look very, very similar to a methadone program over there and stuff. And it occurs to me that when we begin to talk about the individuality of recovery, but it also being social, but it being by a shared group of people who might do something together, which another set of people might not even want, it becomes much harder to prescribe and manualize that stuff and all the other things that people think of in that kind of.
Well, I mean, and this is an enormously important area. I mean, I suspect that standardization is there it's supposed to provide accountability and specificity to what's being provided. It's supposed to justify funding. And
don't get me wrong, Tim, I'm really comfortable with that. As a diabetic, I quite like the idea that the drugs that I get taken from the doctor have got a reason. I'm pretty reassured what they're doing, if you know what I mean. Yes. So standardization
absolutely.
is okay.
I mean, RCTs are the right thing for that sort of stuff. I mean, I recovered from hepatitis C due to innovations in treatment, and I like to know that they've been researched and aren't some sort of mumbo jumbo. But yeah, nevertheless, I don't think personally, and this is a tentative statement because I don't think you can avoid that in this field, that actually the treatments that pretend to be technologies, that is to say that there's some sort of way of conversing with people that will somehow change their consciousness or whatever, the way they think, and that will reliably, through the mechanisms that you're supposed to be attributing to this therapy, that somehow that's working. We know that is not the case. You can take any therapy that's sensible and respectful and structured, and it will produce more or less exactly the same outcomes, regardless of underlying models, philosophies, or whatever. It's called the dodo-bird verdict. I expect you've heard of that. The idea that all therapies actually have the same outcomes. This is true of general psychotherapy as well as addiction treatment. And what they do is that they do a bit better than doing nothing at all. So they tend to have sort of rather modest effect sizes, but they are statistically significant.
Yeah.
And so they're helpful in one way. Now you can go and search for common factors and all this sort of thing, and there's no doubt that having a good relationship and rapport with the person who's working with you on a professional basis is that's good. And also believing somewhat in the efficacy of what you're receiving is good. And there are a variety of other things, but it's simply a key and a lock. It isn't the garden you go into when you open the door. It's so whatever treatment is, it's a catalyst for something else. And some people need lots of it, and there are various sensible reasons for that, and other rather more mysterious reasons for that. And there are other people who can be over-treated. You give them for too much of this kind of intervention, they actually do worse. There are all kinds of varieties about it, but society generally tends to want to regulate these things to some extent and wants to give people some idea of what they might receive. That's quite new, actually, that idea that patients need to know about things. But and you can see the point in it, and you can sort of also see that if you invest a lot in your professional training, you might want to believe in what you're doing. But nevertheless, I think we have to be very modest about the effectiveness of this. We need to provide it. I mean, there are people who simply are so lost and so disadvantaged that unless they have a safe place to go for a bit, they're just not going to get a purchase on changing their lives.
Absolutely.
And also within that asylum that rehab provides, you can meet people, you can make friends and connections. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't just junk it. But if you want to know whether rehab works by doing some sort of randomized controlled trials comparing different types of rehabs or not rehabs or day care against, you'll get nowhere, because basically what works is when somebody goes to something that makes sense to them, they stick around because they feel inclined to do that. And if they finish the course, we know that they're going to get something out of it that will help them in the future. What's also very important is what they do next, and that of course is the recovery bit. You know, the recovery bit is far more important than the entry point. There are many entry points. People don't need to go to rehab. I've known people. There was a chap who started NA in this country. One of them was an actor, a very very lovely actor guy, and the other one was a hairdresser from East London who basically crawled to their first meeting on their knees, never went anywhere near a counsellor or a rehab centre, but just got to a meeting, met this other chap, and they started NA in London. And there are lots of examples like him. So the entry points to recovery are many and various, but we should be providing people with the best opportunity, and in the most disadvantaged areas, we should be providing lots of it. I like day rehab because it's embedded in the recovery community. It's in the community which people are going to be living in, where they are living in already. It connects them to people that they're going to be going to recovery activities with. You can actually introduce. There's a complete sort of embeddedness in a good intensive day treatment program that for me, for some people, it may be better than going to a residential, but other people it's the other way around.
And I like your notion that it's the key to the garden rather than the garden itself. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say to me for more years than I can ever remember that, actually getting off is the relatively easier half of the bit of the journey than the staying off. But what strikes me is that we put quite a lot of intensity at times in the getting off the treatment, and it's very intense, of course, when it comes to rehab and stuff. And then somehow there's a lack of intensity afterwards, unless you're talking about something like we've talked about, which can be quite intensive day rehabs or a complicated network of programs or a complicated network of activities and support space, some addiction, some community. But for quite a lot of people, I was literally just doing some interviews the other day. They have an intensity of rehab and then return home alone to a single bedroom flat somewhere, and somehow it's expected to make a go of it from there. Well,
I mean, and that's redoubled. If there used to be a sort of industry of taking people from different countries into rehabs in England and then returning them to that country where there really wasn't any recovery resource whatsoever. And there was an experiment which was taken up by some people in Middlesbrough to send people to rehab in the south of England, and they raised money to do that, and there was a channel, and they all went back to Middlesbrough, and none of them stayed in recovery at all. So eventually they gave it up, and the reason was exactly that. In those days, which is very different from now, Middlesbrough didn't have a recovering community. It didn't have people who could support those folk and help them to continue their journey. Nowadays, Middlesbrough is almost a centre of excellence for recovery. I know people running lived experience recovery organisations in Teesside, and it's as good as you get. So that intensity to being in a way cast out into the non-intensity of the bedsit and so on is a real problem, and was a real problem. I think there's different kinds of intensity too, because there's that kind of medical emergency. The addict who's throwing up blood and has got liver ascites, and and is carted off into a kind of emergency room. And there's the intensity, the sort of psychological intensity of some rehabs.
And we should never lose sight of that. I mean, we always forget, and some people don't understand this, which is why I think that the broadened space is much better. You can only recover if you're alive to do so. You returned. Yeah. You mentioned that really early. You've got to stay alive before you can recover.
Yeah, and you very quickly lose that. One of the things I guess that is quite good about going to 12-step meetings is you do keep getting reminded of the seriousness of the predicament.
Okay.
I remember Gordon Morse, who was a doctor at Clouds. He described when he's in his early residencies, seeing people projectile vomiting blood and then dying. It's really serious stuff. Particularly alcohol can really mess you up physically, and it kills people, a lot of people. And if you can't stop drinking, that's actually a real problem.